till now we have talked about the whole drama of human life and the interactions between biology and psychology and the social pressures and how the brain creates its own cognitive frameworks and how emotions sometimes helps, sometimes they disrupt, and how people internalize and externalize stress, what is the borderland between normal and abnormal, and how the the biological and psychological changes which are happening in your own body and mind interact with the societal changes, and how society expects you to change and behave in its formalized way. So, this pressure of you are already changing every minute, but once you become conscious of it, how much of it is voluntary and how much of it is involuntary, that is the real differentiation. And we will be talking from about that is transformation and change and all these things are a reality, is the can the mind do it, or and maybe quote one or two examples, some people who have really done it. But before that, which I will take it from maybe after one or two lectures, before that let me give you an example of a set of human behavior which highlights this interaction, which also brings in the question which we had addressed but still not answered about few lectures back, that where is the will, because this set of behavior has always, right from the age of mythology to changing political systems to changing religious beliefs, every aspect questions this. This set of behavior is always questionable, but at the same time everybody does it. Everybody expects the person doing it to be morally responsible for it, and everybody expects the person who is doing it to change willfully, to have your control over that behavior, and yet simultaneously treatment modalities have been defined. So, let me repeat the whole thing. This set of behavior is universal. Everybody does it in some form or the other. The people who are doing are most of the time some stigma is attached to them, they are looked down upon, and nobody looks at oneself while doing it. They set of moral instructions and they are supposed to be taking a willful control of this behavior and try to change it. That is one approach. People are considered responsible for this behavior. The other approach, which is almost parallel because of being undecided of what exactly all this is, and that is you define this set of behavior as illness and expect the medical science to treat it. So, the result is that it is not working both ways. Though there have been huge improvements with the advent of neurosciences and medical pharmaceutical treatments, but if you honestly ask any psychiatrist, he would say that we do not know, it may work, it may not work. So, what is this? This is the whole area of what we call vices. You know what vices are, and if you want another term for it, it is called sin. Is there something called sin? So, look at it, just think for a minute, like you have been thinking all through this course, introspect and answer whether you have had a feeling of sin. Where does the sin come from? Is it biological? Is it ingrained in the cognitive framework? Like Freud used to call something called taboo. So, taboos are genetically transmitted, or are they cultural memes, like what Dawkins has created a word, memes. Like you transmit genes, you transmit cultural memes, which are pattern of behavior, which go on and on. Is it a social construct? Vices is a social construct or a biological construct? Because it has a huge underpinning on how the individual behaves in this. And this is the previous lecture which we talked about the pressure of change when something is considered as abnormal. When something is considered as abnormal, it is either changed through punishment, which is the law, or through treatment, which is mental illness, or the person himself, when he is struggling with the societal or personal pressures, tries to change himself. That is one big, you would not change unless you are misfit. Now, if somebody tells you that you are misfit, that may bring in change or may not, or if you feel that you yourself are misfit. So, the possibility of this, the example of this, the biggest example is in this whole area of what is considered as sinful activity. But let us see what is the whole drama all about. In India, from Indus Valley till Kama Sutra and much later, wine, gambling, Mahabharat, sexuality, hunting were common themes and were accepted as part of life. Soma was a central theme of Veda. Now, the soma was not alcohol, or it was probably a concoction of many things, but soma was the rasa, the elixir of life. Vedas mention it. There was nothing as real pap or pun mentioned in the Indian scriptures or in the Indian psyche. Although on the surface it may appear and various political groups may say certain things about it, irrespective of religion. It always warned people against addiction. Addiction is ati sakti, or what we call asakti, against which when we talk of Gandhi in the last two lectures. Now, Gandhi wrote his version of Gita as anasakti. So, anasakti, which was a detachment, versus ati sakti, attachment. So, they always warned against the failure to give up. You want to give up, and this feeling of just one more, just one more actually is the source of addiction. You can place whatever we have talked about the biology and society and psychology into the Indian thought process, and it is important that we know, because we are sitting in India and talking, and lot of you young people may know it, may not know it, but Indian thought process was extremely liberal and extremely balanced in its approach, in the sense of that they had already thought of, they not in exact term of cognition and emotion and impulses and all, but probably in spite of not knowing the neurobiology and the neurochemistry, they would have observed from behavior, and they would have been really great people to think that if you just compare what we are thinking now with the thought process, you will be almost able to map it. So, what they said, that the purpose of life was dharma, which is your doing the righteousness of the given time, of maintaining the society, pursuit of material things. They did not say immaterial and leave and all. They are not talking about spirituality. And moksha, final liberation from going through all these steps, that you maintain within a societal framework. You have a certain set of duty, which is your dharma, which you should follow to gain material pursuits for yourself and for your family. Ultimately liberate yourself from all this cycle, but not without kama. Now the kama, when they talk of, is not sexuality. They are talking of not per se physical sex, but they are talking of the whole idea of this libido, what Freud later on talks of libido. So dharma, artha, kama and moksha were the four pillars in which the life moves. And if you look at it, in the modern psychology, both the artha may be the action, the material external world. Dharma is the cognitive framework which you make through your experience, through your training, through your religion, through your mythology, through your work, through your skills. And kama is the emotional force. So they have already talked of dharma as cognition, kama as emotion, leading to a material world of artha, and finally you move out of it. So asceticism and eroticism were already a part of Indian psyche and equally accepted. There was nothing sinful about it, as I said, although they warned you against the addiction part of it. So addiction means what? Like we were talking about the normal and abnormal. So being abnormal is getting skewed away from the normal range of behavior, isn't it? So addiction means getting skewed and tilted to one side, or getting involved in some behavior which is which tilts off the balance of this life and throws you out of gear of this four pillars of life. And they always, and they again went deeper, is that you have a pravritti and nivritti. Pravritti is like the push from within, that is your nature, your temperament and your tendency to follow a certain path, which may be tilted and not tilted, and ultimately the execution of it, the release from that, the release from your thing is nivritti. So all you act is from your pravritti, you act towards nivritti. So four pillars, and you go through a cognitive framework and an emotional framework, move towards material thing and finally get liberated within. So this and the underlying thing is your own temperament, your own impulse, your own pravritti, which finally leads you to liberation. Against this background, Hinduism was very violent in its sensuality, and it was not one subtle poetic type of it. When they approached sensuality, they approached in a very, very aggressive way. Look at some of the scriptures. But equal backlash was seen in maybe in the last 2000 years or less than that, 1000 years, where the whole sensuality was channelized to devotion and following 11th century. So till 11th century, the literature, the architecture, everything more or less had this undercurrent apart from other things. But following that, there was sudden suppression of the whole thing, and almost like a backlash. The guilt from the Shastra, the Arth Shastra and the Manu came guilt and blame. Then they started talking about renunciation. Gautam Buddha was there, and you know Buddha's thing. The desirelessness in Buddhism was meant to go beyond it, because Buddha said sabbam dukkham, that all dukkha, all misery, all sadness actually comes from desire. So you have to go beyond desire, which included sensuality and sexuality and everything. Whereas these scriptures which were offering code of life attached some amount of guilt and blame to the sensuality and sexuality. Why I am talking of sensuality and sexuality? Because that seems to be the vice, most of the vices. If you look at it, why were they talking about going beyond sexuality? And even some people went up to saying that one it was a male dominated world, a patriarchal world, which was saying the woman is a door to hell. A woman is never a door to the hell. It was their mind which was the door to the hell, because they probably were unable to balance their emotional impulse of sexuality against their cognitive framework of controlling it, and that was probably a big roadblock in going beyond and renunciation and whatever their own aims were. In this background, if you look at it, there is no real addiction. The only real addiction is sex. Your brain does not seek alcohol, your brain does not seek drug. How do they get into it is a different issue, but sex is something which is always there in the mind. And why has it become like this is, I mean, we'll just come back to it. So, when Mughals came to India, opium, wine, but at the same time repression of free expression of sex with their religious pressures and all. Christianity really brought in the concept of sin, guilt, penance, and that the Victorian era of guilt and shame was brought to its colonies also. So, what are the 7 deadly sins? Wrath, greed, sloth, pride, lust, envy, gluttony. Now, why I am saying sexuality and these things are related, because in evolution, when probably this is a hypothetical theory, in evolution when the animals were on the fore and from the tetraped the man became a bipedal thing, his hands were free to do lot of things. Animals before that were restricted in their activity, and most of the animals they lived a life of in harmony with natural rhythm. So, when they do sex, and that too is not all the time. It is regulated by cycles, from the hormonal cycles to the natural cycles. So, animal sexuality is limited to certain periods. But when man stood up, lot of the powers of animals like extreme sensation, sensory abilities, extreme motor abilities, the ability to fly, everything was restricted. So, man became restricted in its sensory and motor physicality. Now, having said this, but what was restricted here was opened up in mind. So, similarly, when the hands became free, man started doing multitasking, which the animals were not capable of. So, the sexuality itself was restricted bodily. So, animals their body, the way it involved in a sexual activity was totally hormone dependent and all, but man's body was free to do multitasking at a lot of the time. So, sexuality also got limited, and this limitation of physicality of sexuality possibly opened up the whole brain to be sexual all the time. So, it is only human beings who can switch on and switch off their sexuality, although it can be controlled with the mood state and thought, and so the real struggle of addiction remains is here. And Freud was not totally off the mark when he mentioned this, the whole theory of repression and all, because if you study history and look at the anthropology and look at the way societies have evolved, you will really find out that there is some truth in the whole thing. So, this concept of sin, the guilt, penance, Victorian guilt and shame which was taken to the colonies including India, the repression was less in Mughal times, because you still, if you go to Rajasthan and all, you will find a whole lot of miniature paintings happening at that time on Krishna, which were totally erotic paintings, and that is also a part of big culture. Even if you, but this issue of guilt and shame has not, is not a new thing. If you look at the 2 big epics of India like Ramayana and Mahabharata, and you closely observe, you will find that a lot of characters in Ramayana are guilt ridden. They have, in order to comply to obedience, in order to comply to loyalty, in order to comply to what was prescribed, the tradition, the orthodoxy, they had a certain amount of guilt in not being able to complete it. Whereas, if you compare Mahabharata, very few of them appear to be having guilt. Even Duryodhan, who was considered to be the most evil of all, or Shakuni, or even the tricks which Krishna and other people did, they never seemed to have guilt. They were bothered about the social impact of it. So, while Ramayana is the epic of obeying social norms, Mahabharata is about reconstruction of society, and in that everything goes in. So, they are not bothered. So, maybe they have not considered this whole issue of guilt and shame in these exact new psychological terms, but the basis was already there. And this is the 7 deadly sins brought in by Christianity. So, what is the status now? Let us map it, because this is very important that you understand that, and you all understand, sexuality is still a pressure in modern mind. People fight against it, they call it bad, they do not want to talk about it, and they want to change itself. The biggest changes which people try to do is in and around this. After all, how many people take drugs? Very few. How many people take alcohol? Very few. But they still want to keep transforming against this basic force, and that probably brought in Freud to put everything together to the repressed sexuality. So, the status, if you look at it and try to map and think over it, is that probably biological findings are reflecting the socio-psychological understanding of past. And how? We have talked about limbic brain, emotions versus thinking brain. Now, emotions were kama and this was dharma, in a very, very broad understanding. These terms of are new terms, like, but we already knew what a bhav was. In the rasa theory we mentioned. So, probably they were talking about the basic emotion, and that basic emotion and how it transforms, how it really goes up to bringing in a more complex layer of thought processing, almost an interface with the society, right. So, this is the basis of biology, this is the basis of our talk also, cognition and emotions. What emerges out of it is need for change from self or society, which again interacts with this and this to bring in change or transformation. What is the difference between a transformation and change, and how to go about it in your personal life, so that you really do not need a therapist? We will talk about after this, we finish this lecture. So, this is the whole background, and you have heard this is a famous, ontogeny begets phylogeny. Individual development, the way you born till your mind grows, is almost a repetition of how the species has grown. The same way of evolution, like we talked about, if you remember, motor brain comes first, and then the limbic brain comes, that is the emotional brain, and then the neocortex is the last. This is how actually the human mind also develops, in the sense that once you are born, you have neurons in place, your upbringing, your experiences, as you grow on, there are critical periods in the growth period. Your mind challenges, the environment throws challenges at you, your mind responds to it, and in the process the mind develops another framework, or in the hierarchy of your cognitive frameworks. That is how a species also. So, when a child is born, it is just a bunch of, we can move, there is a motor brain like all lower species. then he starts, after a month he starts expressing emotions like crying and smiling and all, which is again the next level of hierarchy. And the thinking brain actually develops, there is a huge gap, the thought keeps developing, as you heard of Piaget and Vygotsky theories, but actually when it comes to it, it is by the time 18 or 20 you one can really listen to this. The mind actually starts listening to this dynamics of thought and emotion. So, the real thinking brain is coming around. So, human behavior, like it follows the species, the phylogeny, the human behavior, thought and emotions are a result of brain processes. You remember I used a word when we were talking of how the brain creates stories, about a word called emergent. So, from basic information bits, as it moves up in hierarchy, it keeps forming more higher complex pattern, and ultimately your whatever is going on in your brain, suppose nothing comes out, what is the way to know that what I am thinking? You know what I am thinking is through what I am telling you, through the language, through the words. So, language may be an inner process, but the expression of it, the way I write my slide, the way I tell you, the way I interact with you or you interact with me is behavior. So, what we know is, what we have learned of human beings is through the behavior. They are result of the brain processes, but is there a feedback loop that the human behavior shapes up the brain process. So, there is a result of brain processes is human behavior, but the human behavior shapes up the brain process in a feedback loop. So, you interact on the environment, self interacts on the environment, brings in some change, this change again is gone to the self, and self modifies its behavior again to act on environment. This part is behavior, this part is experience of result. If you remember, we talked of reward and dopamine, we will talk about it more. This is the basis. So, whatever is going on in your head through your experience and all, you have learned the way, you want to act in a certain way, and whatever results you get, your mind tells you, and you keep doing it, you get rewards. So, again you see all these things are falling in place till now. I will end at this, we will continue this in the next lecture, and then go on to transformation. Thank you.